Hi, my name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center, and welcome to this episode of Washington Policy on the Go. We'll be speaking with our Center for Education Director, Finne, in just a couple of moments. We'll talk to her about the latest on critical race theory mandates in the Washington State education system affecting teachers. We'll talk with her about that. We'll also check in with our director for our Center for Healthcare, Elizabeth Hovde. She is going to cover how it is the governor makes the claim that his directives saved thousands of lives and are responsible for Washington State's relatively low COVID death rate. We'll take a closer look at the governor's claims as she has, and we'll see if they hold up. I'd like to remind everybody, if you're joining us for the first time on Washington Policy on the Go, we encourage you to ask questions at any time. You have the Q&A box as part of your Zoom tools. It's the one with the two little conversation bubbles. Just type your question in that tool at any point during the conversation. We do try and get all the questions answered. We've had just a couple of episodes where we haven't been able to do that. So the center directors have kindly gone in and answered those questions after the event. So we do try and answer everything. And if we don't get to you, please don't be offended. The program is up to an hour long. We won't necessarily go the full hour, although we do. But if we do, we try to cut it off at exactly the hour mark to respect your time, your lunch break, as well as those of staff here as well. Keep it in line and sharp. We also encourage you to check out our website, washingtonpolicy.org, on a regular basis. Our blog is updated daily by our center directors, and they have the latest and insightful and often cutting news information about state policy and how that policy is going to impact you, your wallet, your family, the way you're able to govern your own business. So it's an important blog. I think it's one of the best in Washington State. I used it for many years before I joined Washington Policy Center as a radio broadcaster. I relied on it for news and information, as I'm sure you will too, if you check that out. And don't keep it to yourself. Share it with friends. We want to make sure this information spreads as far as possible. And of course, if you know someone who wanted to attend today, or you think somebody would benefit by attending today, we will upload this video to our YouTube channel so you can share it with them at a future date if you'd like. Right now, I'd like to call up Finne. She is our Center for Education Director, and she's got a new blog post about, she's been following the critical race theory issue very closely, and how it's been immersing itself in the Washington State education system. Leave, you found that the Professional Educator Standards Board is kind of taking what the legislature passed and the governor signed and running with it, and it could mean that teachers, if they want to teach in Washington State, are going to have to immerse themselves in critical race theory and teach it from the class perspective. Describe how this comes about and what it looks like.
Well, last week, the Professional Educator Standards Board, which is the board, the state agency that governs the accreditation and licensing and the maintenance of teachers and the maintenance of their licenses, passed a new set of rules, the cultural competency, diversity, equity, and inclusion rules that are now going to require teachers, as a condition of getting a license and maintaining the license, to be fully steeped in this very harmful, divisive, false ideology. And I testified in opposition to the board adopting these rules. And there were several very excellent speakers after me from the group called Fair for All, a national group that is opposing these hateful standards. And they testified also against it. But despite our testimony, the board went forward. And I'll have to tell you something interesting that happened. The teachers union appeared to testify, and they're concerned that the program we have in the state for evaluating teachers is going to be infused with this critical race theory. And so that teachers will be judged on their performance in the classroom based on these concepts. So it's interesting to see the unions sending out an alarm signal about this. We'll see what happens going forward. These rules will be subject to rulemaking. There may be some changes to them, but essentially the bottom line is that these rules will require teachers to teach children racial intolerance, to require teachers to teach children that our government is based on institutional racism, which is a falsehood. It's a false ideology. I've written about it many times now, and it is now being infused within the accreditation process and licensing process for teachers. It's discouraging development.
Would this impact teachers that are already there, or would they be kind of grandfathered in and immune from whatever requirements are made on new teachers regarding critical race theory?
Well, the teachers that are already there have to periodically take professional development courses to maintain their licenses, and this will be part of that. So the teachers that are already there are going to be impacted as well. And I mean, what's amazing here is that the lawyers have gone silent on all these boards because it's clearly illegal. It's going to create hostile work environments for teachers that do not subscribe to this theology. It's a theology. It's going to create they will violate the First Amendment rights and civil rights of teachers in our schools, and as if it isn't hard enough to be a teacher already. I read through these rules that they passed, Dave. You'd be shocked. The teachers now have to buy into this bad idea of restorative justice, which is what's leading the Clover Park School District to pass rules that require the discipline to be given based on the race of the student. So for the same infraction, a white student will get a tougher punishment than a Black or brown student. And this is so unfair across the board. All the students and teachers know it's wrong. So this is going to cause a great deal of strife. It's going to set teacher against teacher, teacher against principal, student against student. This is a very harmful thing that's coming to, as if things aren't bad enough with already, 70% of our students are failing the state math test, 52% are failing the state English test. We're spending $18,000 per student in each, per student on average statewide. And what has the system done but introduced a highly controversial, divisive theology into the schools?
Well, it keeps people from talking about the what was it, 55% that are failing the reading and the 70 some odd percent failing the math. I mean, if you can keep people constantly outraged about the new thing and upset about the new thing, they don't have to, they don't take a step back and say, no, wait a second, this system has been failing these students, grade by grade by grade, and you can't make that up. It's one thing to take a step back and say it's failing, but when you actually take a step back and think, okay, well, that means that these groups of students, are going to start their adult lives with some woeful disadvantages that can lead to some serious social problems going ahead, and that are totally unfair to them. I mean, it's I'm not saying it's on purpose, but I do think it's convenient, and it's outrageous in itself.
You're so right. It's a huge distraction from the important job of providing knowledge and skills to students that they will need to succeed in life. And what I find, I just find the whole thing repugnant. I mean, it teaches that white students are oppressors and that Black and Hispanic students are victims. Neither student is well served with such a mindset. It hurts students of all races and sets them further behind. And I mean, they are basically lowering the expectations for the schools by doing this, because to teach this crazy wacko orthodoxy now it's super complex. You have to understand about, microaggressions and safe spaces and all kinds of crazy nonsense. And this is what they're going to spend time in the classroom learning, instead of learning how to do math and reading and get ready for their lives in the future. So I think there's just going to be incredible discord now you're going to see across our school districts, instead of unifying and working together to help the kids catch up from their pandemic learning loss, which is so important, so that they are not saddled with, lower earnings and less opportunities in the future. We should be focusing on that. Instead, these state agencies are putting in this hateful ideology. It's a real distraction. You wonder if that isn't the purpose of it, to distract from the attention being paid to the test scores. And what I'm concerned about is that they're going to eliminate the tests altogether, because I've been hearing noises about that. They're lowering grading standards. They're forcing teachers to pass students that are not reaching the grade levels that they should, the grades that they should have been, that they would have been required to reach in the past. Now they're lowering grading standards and testing standards. Maybe they'll, who knows what is coming. But you see the whole, if you're going to be consistent with this theory, they want to eliminate the gap in learning between white and Asian students and Black and Hispanic students. And so in order to do that, they have to crush the achievement of white and Asian students, so there is no gap. And so they're removing programs for gifted students. They are lowering the expectations for all the students, so then there will be no gap. And it's a very socialist idea. No one should be ahead of the other. And that's not the way to serve children in our society. That's not the way to allow every individual to get ahead. We need to create schools that bring out the best in every single child, that bring out all their talents and not hold them back. So this is very bad.
Yeah, you can just imagine the families in troubled and failing school districts are not sitting there thinking, what will really make me feel better is if we tear away the better classes that are held elsewhere, because that'll make us closer to even. It's like people who dream of a better life for themselves don't sit around thinking, if only the mansions in Medina and Bellevue and other places, if only those households, if they lost, if there's an earthquake or something and it damaged all their buildings, then we'd be closer to equal and I'd feel so much better about it. Yes. They want opportunity to excel. Together. Right. Yeah. They want to grow and achieve together. So that is crazy. And I'm not an attorney, but I know you are. How does a different disciplinary system based on race jive with Initiative 200, where we prohibited discrimination in the state based on race? And I know that there was an attempt to get rid of that law, but it's still the law of the state as far as I can tell. I don't see how that holds water.
No, we reapproved that law with Initiative 88. You might recall a few years back, there was an attempt. So on the books, on the laws of the state of Washington, prohibit the government from giving preference to anyone based on their skin color or their race. And regardless, ignoring that law, the state legislature last year and the governor signed Senate Bill 5044 to put critical race theory in the schools. And now all these school districts that are implementing this, they all have lawyers on staff. They are deliberately ignoring the law. And this is not a good trend, of course. We all have to respect the law. But when there are laws put in place that violate our consciences, there is a respected sort of strain of thinking that civil disobedience is a good way to go. All right. There are people speaking about not following an illegal law, and that is a respected, accepted mode in our society. So knowing about it is the first step. But watching you see the crazy thing. If you see something crazy going on in your school district that makes no sense, it's coming from critical race theory.
One of the things that I hear the most about your work on critical race theory is that the law doesn't specifically say critical race theory, or say this professional requirements board. They're not specifically saying critical race theory. They're talking about cultural diversity or some other language. What's for those who are new and haven't heard you before? What's new about that? What would you say?
Well, if you look at the law, Senate Bill 5044, it is not about diversity, equity, and inclusion, as people are claiming it is, because it actually says to eliminate institutional racism in the title of the law. Okay, so let's think about this. If you are trying to push diversity, equity, and inclusion, you don't tie that to racism. You say, so the two are two separate things. Now, the two were brought together in that law, and therefore it is critical race theory. There's no question about it. If you read what the training manuals are, that are being, every school board under that law, every school board director and every teacher in the state is required to receive training in this diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you look at the training materials, and I did an analysis of that, that were created by this Washington State School Directors Association. It's on our website. It's full of critical race theory. It talks about white supremacy, oppression, victims, safe spaces, allies. Okay, part of this whole notion is that they're going to teach children that they need to find allies in the fight against racism. Okay, so this is not what schools are for. You're not supposed to go to get an education to find allies, to fight and to strike. I mean, this is an indoctrination in a certain way of thinking. You wonder why students in Seattle walked out of class the other day because they want to force children to wear masks. That's completely crazy thinking. Makes no sense whatsoever. But they're being encouraged by their teachers to take a political stand on something. And what's the most obvious one out there now? It's the masks. Should we force masks on children in the schools or not? And so I predict a lot more students walking out, teachers walking out, continued spending on the public schools, less learning, lowering of academic standards. This is what CRT is bringing to our state.
You brought up spending there, and I'm glad you did, because one of your more recent blogs details the level of spending now in Washington State, now north of $18,000. How did you get that number? Have you gotten blowback? Is there anyone disputing those numbers? Because what most people are hearing still, not just in national media, where it might apply to some other states, but we still hear it here too, that education is woefully underfunded. And we have, and how much are we spending actually per student per year in the state?
Well, we are spending $18,175 per student on average statewide, and that number is reported by the Office of Financial Management on their website, fiscal, fiscal.wa.gov, G-O-V. And if you go to the K-12 portion and you look at the workload, staffing, and finance chart for the state of Washington, in the lower right-hand corner, there is expenditures per FTE, which means full-time equivalent student. And in the lower right-hand corner, you can find that number for 21-22. So the fact that people don't know that's the number is the fault of the publications that they're getting their information from. What can I say? I mean, I report these numbers from official sources all the time. I've never been questioned on the accuracy of my numbers because they're accurate. They're coming from the state of Washington. So the fact is that I'll encourage you to find out exactly what is being spent in your district, because if you go to that website, fiscal.wa.gov, you can get the drop-down menu for the 295 districts in the state of Washington and get the actual amount that your district is spending. And in some of the bigger districts, like in Seattle, that number is higher because the number I gave you is an average statewide. For example, Seattle Public Schools spends $22,000 per student, okay, because it has a rich property base, and we are sending local levy dollars to Seattle Public Schools. So there are some districts that are going to be under the $18,000 average, but on average, most districts are around $18,000 per student. So if you just think about this, that's over $400,000 per a classroom of 25 students. And that means that, the teachers are now getting paid a pay and benefit package worth $120,000 per teacher. So we have then well over $300,000 is being spent to support the teacher in every classroom. And that should tell everybody everything they need to know, because the public schools are run by bloated bureaucracies. Too much money is being spent on keeping people staffed in district headquarters who never see a child. And that is the failure of public education. Too much of the money intended for the classroom is being diverted to these bureaucracies. And the solution is very simple. Give the money directly to the families. $10,000, $7,000, whatever we think is reasonable. So each family who can control that money and homeschool or pay private school tuition. That's the solution. That will have all kinds of beneficial effects, one of which would be that if we did that on a big enough scale, you would see the radical CRT activists chased out of public schools because the public schools would say, we can't accommodate this nonsense any longer. We will clean up our own act so we don't lose our families. I mean, 41,000 families have left Washington's public schools in the last 2 years because they are so upset with all kinds of reasons regarding the public schools. Obviously, if you're getting a free public education, you're not going to easily take on the burden, financial or personal, of educating your own child. So 41,000 families have left the public schools, which tells you something is very wrong in the public schools in Washington state. And if you start letting that money go with them, you will find that the radical activists that have now taken over the State Board of Education, OSPI, the legislature would be pushed out because they would be too afraid to lose that money going forward. So that's really the only solution here. You cannot fix this by repealing laws, really. You need to move the money to the control of the parents, because what we have here is a system where parents have no control whatsoever. They shut down the school for 13 months. They put masks on our students for another year, and parents can't do a thing about it. The teachers union doesn't want to go back and reopen the schools. Anyway, we can go on forever about how badly the parents were treated during COVID. I hope we don't forget what happened.
So we've had a number of requests come in asking if you would post kindly the place where they can get that number specifically
Yes.
on a blog or something coming up soon. Would that
Sure,
be all right?
I can certainly do that with pleasure.
Okay, so we have lots of questions coming in for you, but we'll get to those during the Q&A portion. So I'm going to leave it there before you leave, and we'll call you back here in a few minutes.
Okay.
Let's first check in with Elizabeth Hovde. She is our Center for Healthcare Director, as well as the Director for our Center for Worker Rights. Elizabeth, you took a closer look at Governor Inslee's recent claims. He held a press conference where he talked about he gave himself credit basically for saving a lot of lives and keeping the COVID death rate very low in Washington state. And he said it was due to the tough decisions he had to make regarding restrictions. Why is he wrong? What's wrong with his claims? What are some of the flaws that you're finding?
Well, there's been a lot of claims, not just the press conference, but every time he seems to talk about it, because it seems to be a justification point for keeping his emergency powers and keeping these mandates in place and having a vaccine mandate. The problem with it is, even in the state's own materials, it's comparing the lowest cumulative death rates since the pandemic began. And it's saying that because of our moves in Washington, we have one of the lowest. We're tied for number 5 with Maine, and all 4 states who are above us either did not have a vaccine mandate or they had a vaccine mandate with a testing requirement. So the claim is not backed up by the data.
Do they take into consideration, or do the claims take into consideration the age of the population and those other kinds of variables that have had a big impact on on the different overall per capita death rates of larger populations?
That's exactly the point. There are so many factors to claim that a mandate on vaccines for employees or a mask mandate in public places is to get the credit for low cumulative death rates is just off target.
How does Washington state's death rate compare to the rest of the country? And what's the difference between, say, the state impacted the worst versus, the states impacted the least?
I'm in the process of looking at all states and doing charting on that. But when the governor released, or the government released their forward campaign, they bragged about being among the top 5. So that's where I started looking at this, is comparing it to the top 5. We are one of the lowest. However, as I said, 4 states above us didn't have vaccine mandates or didn't have them and had a testing alternative. As far as the masks go, only one of the states listed in the top 5 was a state that had a mask mandate that lasted longer than ours. The other 4 states either didn't have one or didn't have one that lasted very long.
And so the governor's office was basically saying, these restrictions were the key to saving lives in Washington State. You're saying, even in the top 5, there's enough variability there, variables there, and varied results that what you're claiming doesn't fit, right?
Right. And I think it's, it's really hard when it comes down to a vaccine mandate. When you have people being fired or resigning because of a vaccine mandate in your state, when both people who are unvaccinated and vaccinated can spread the disease, it's just a lame justification for having such a mandate. And I'd like to see it taken away.
Yeah, it seems like the primary risk would be for the person making the decision about themselves, right? I mean, if both can spread the disease and both have the same viral load, while they're breathing or exhaling or coughing or whatever the case may be, the real danger comes to that person, their risk preferences.
Yeah, at this point, with what we know about the virus, the vaccine mandate is just completely inappropriate, and we knew about the contraction and spread before the mandate began. So I'm confused why it was ever in place. But it's also created this huge vaccine discrimination in our state that I think is unfortunate. And I'd rather see us focused on keeping people healthy.
Well, it seemed to me that one of the things about the framing of this was, and look, I mean, it was a tough call early on when people don't know what's happening or how devastating it is. When you're watching the Chinese government welding people into their apartment buildings, it's a pretty frightening thing. But there's plenty of time to take a look at what was happening to say, okay, now there's a measured response. But what the governor seems to be saying here is almost in light of the emergency powers reform debate, which is, hey, without my mandates, without me making these decisions and sticking with these decisions, why some other legislature might have come along and changed their mind. It's perfectly possible they would agree with every decision that he made, but it's also possible that, someone else might have made the call. So he's kind of positioning himself as, hey, I'm the one, I can make these mandates, I can make these restrictions, and this is what saves people. But it's disturbing that he's not looking at the rest of the evidence, because it's tough to admit that you're wrong. It's tough to say, hey, we didn't need this restriction because there's trade-offs. And in no part of this conversation was there references to some of the trade-offs, like, kids losing a year of schooling, or the mental health impact on children where, there's an increase in depression and anxiety and other things, not just children, but other people as well, the businesses that have collapsed and other things. I realize this isn't a specific healthcare question, but, in the governor's comments or elsewhere, was there mention of these trade-offs, and was there concern addressed about, the impact of those things versus the mandates themselves?
No, and in the written communication, it's not there either. And look, if the emergency powers were not in place, we do and have said many times, we think the lawmakers, which are dominated by the governor's party, would probably go along with many of the things the governor has done. But at least you would get some debate and some input and cautions, and what you're saying, bringing up instances in which the cure is worse than the disease. In some cases, the vaccines have proven able to keep hospitalization and death away from many individuals. Many people have gladly taken the vaccines, and individual liberty has been honored for them. But we've created vaccine discrimination in workplaces and social settings and families, and the government has helped that all along the way.
It's interesting. Some of the WPC critics that I've seen, when Todd Myers wrote his pieces about problems with the governor's COVID dials that were supposed to be measuring various metrics for its success, and none of them were accurate. They were all off. they remained inaccurate throughout, and they were usually just yanked or pulled. And then, then the governor assured us after the CDC advised that we didn't need the masks anymore, he was going to take a look at the metrics, which was funny in a way because they hadn't taken a close look at their own metrics. The criticism of WPC was, well, there's WPC trying to downplay the things that are required to make people safe. You're trying to cast doubt on these necessary tools to keep people safe. What would your response to that kind of criticism be?
I would say that there's no argument that masks and vaccines can help with COVID contraction and spread situations, but we're talking about mandates. We're talking about mandating, and the mandating has not brought the results that the governor claims. And look, I want people to be employed. I have no idea how unemploying more Washingtonians with a vaccine mandate makes any sense at all. And, I think it's 1,800 state workers who are out of work because of the vaccine mandate. At this point, the last report I saw on healthcare workers before the federal mandate went in place was 3,000. We're unemploying people, and it can still contract and spread when you have a vaccine mandate. It makes no sense to me. You're not keeping people safer, and it is creating a lot of drama out there between our family members, in our workplaces. I paddle on a dragon boat team, and for a while there in the summer, the people who were vaccinated could paddle outdoors without masks, and the ones who were not vaccinated could not. And then eventually the teammates who were not vaccinated were let go of the team and not welcome there. And I don't think without so much energy behind vaccination is the only way for every individual, that would have happened.
So for now, the state government is digging in its heels on keeping people fired who were fired for not vaccinating, despite recommendations to the contrary elsewhere, and despite, as you point out, the virus spreading whether you're vaccinated or not. So, again, if you're symptomatic and you have to stay home, that's one thing, right?
Right.
Although in my own experience with preschool, it was always, if a kid has a cold, they're supposed to stay home. And then you show up and every kid has a runny nose. And you're like, well, wait a second, why was my kid at home this week? So, but anyway, you can limit it with other means. Yeah.
Say that again. I'm sorry, I interrupted
I just meant, instead of firing people, you could say, if you have these symptoms, you should stay home, since vaccinated and unvaccinated can spread that disease.
Right. And we gave people false security, because so many of us are vaccinated, there was less symptom happening among the vaccinated. So you were convincing people they were safe if they were vaccinated, and they clearly weren't.
All right. Well, let's bring Leave back, and we'll have our Q&A section. And if there's any questions that you have for either of our center directors, I'd urge you to put your question in the Q&A function. Some of you inevitably will put it in the chat function, and I will try and get to those, but it's harder for me to follow because I have to scroll through all the chats, whereas the Q&A box is nicely formatted, so I can just go in and grab each question and rotate them around. So if you did put it in the chat, if you could kind of copy paste it back into the Q&A box, that would be helpful as well. The first question is, what's the status of the proposed capital gains tax? Elizabeth? No, just kidding. This I'll answer that one for Mark here. We actually answered that last week with Jason Mercier. It was defeated in court. It was ruled that it was an income tax. Jason has a great write-up about WPC's work and the importance of that work in that court case that you can see on our blog, and you'll read about in the upcoming Viewpoint magazine that Washington Policy Center puts out. But right now, it's there's appeal being considered, and Jason expects an update sometime in the summer. So stay tuned for that, because let's face it, income taxes in Washington State never die. They're like Jason or Freddy Krueger. They're just sequel after bad sequel just keeps coming out, and that's generally how those things roll. Let's see. Next question from Ray. I couldn't make the PESB meeting last week. This is Professional Education Standards Board, but I would love to know from Leave who from the WA spoke with concern about the ethnic studies rules. I would have thought that WA leaders would be fully on board with these rules. For the record, I am a Washington Education Association member and local union president and a member of the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism.
Thank you, Ray, for that great question. I don't remember the name of the WEA official who testified, but she said something very interesting. She said, you know, it was the union, of course, helped pass Senate Bill 5044. All right. And so she started out by saying how much she supports, and the WA union supports cultural competency, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But then she said, right at the end of her speech, and you can get a copy of the hearing was recorded, so you can get a copy if you're interested. But she said at the very end of her little presentation that, of course, you, the Professional Educator Standards Board, are not going to make these standards part of the TPEP, you know, the Teacher and Principal Evaluation and Growth Program in Washington State, which I thought was, and she then said that the law does not apply to that evaluation program. And I checked the law, and I do not see that that law says that. And I do think that the teachers are now subject to these rules as part of the evaluation of their performance in the classroom. But you see what's happened. The union has pushed a law thinking they're going to get some additional power by bringing up race in every issue by passing this law. And now they're concerned that it's going to hurt teachers in their evaluation, which is very interesting. So what I think should be done here is the teachers who are being mistreated by their own union, basically are having to labor under yet another set of unfair regulations, should just withdraw from that union and stop paying dues to that union, since it's clearly not representing their interests very well by passing and forcing critical race theory upon their performance in the classroom.
Next question. Why are you calling it a theology? Where's God in this picture? That's for you, Leave.
There is no God in this picture. It is a false ideology made up by activists in academia. You can read all the books. There's all kinds of information on this, but the main proponents are creating, I call it a theology because other leading scholars are calling it a theology. And I think it's going to be subject to attack in the courts as a theology because it creates a whole description of what the world is like. It's and it requires obeisance to that thinking. So I think it's a theology. It has no place in public education. It should be chased out of our schools as fast as possible.
Elizabeth, I don't see that we'll ever know the true number of COVID deaths in Washington State, meaning people who died from COVID versus dying with COVID. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. That's been the hard part of analyzing the COVID-19 era, period, is trusting the numbers, knowing the numbers. Testing is random and different in place to place. We don't know who died from or with in many cases. That is the whole problem with tracking these numbers and coming to any conclusion right now. It's kind of like we're on hold for when, I'm not sure, but I'm hoping the data gets more accurate. And instead what you see happening is the data shutting down. So when it's not supporting the conclusions that leaders want, you see some of it going away. The way they're tracking and reporting now in Washington is changing, and same thing with the CDC. So it's a hard part of this whole conversation. And I think common sense often tells us what to do and what to not to do. And that has been the unfortunate thing from the beginning too, is that our common sense has been called into question, and we don't trust ourselves anymore for a while, and then we didn't trust the health officials guiding us. I think this is going to be a huge problem for public health in the future, to have people trusting what they said. It feels like the boy who cried wolf at this point, and it's not been helpful.
Next question.
And David,
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, can I bring up one more thing and maybe we can get to it? The State Board of Health right now is looking at whether or not to require vaccines for school entry for children. And so there's been months of debate over this, and a technical advisory group to set up to advise the State Board of Health how to respond to this question. And the advisory group actually, after watching a bunch of information supplied to them by the State Board of Health, said, no, we should not add this to school entry inclusion, this COVID vaccine. And the State Board of Health will still rule on that, whether they go along with the advice, which said, no, don't do it, or if they're going to override that advice. And actually, they meet on April 13th, and the agenda for that meeting is out tomorrow. So be watching for that if this is something you feel passionately about. And of course, our position has been to keep everything on the level. And thankfully, all of those meetings were ones that you could attend and be involved in, and thousands of comments have come in.
Okay, and I expect that you'll be blogging about that when the agenda comes out, and give people information about how they can attend that meeting and other things. So
yes, I should have something, I think, tomorrow.
So watch for WashingtonPolicy.org, go to the blog. See, this is what I told you at the very beginning. I said, if you watch our blog, you keep track of the things that matter to you when it comes to state policy, and you can share that information with friends, neighbors, and family members. Next question, does CRT promote suppression of free speech against any perspectives other than woke doctrine?
Yes, the answer is yes. It's a violation of your First Amendment rights. There's no question about it. That's why I call it a theology, because you bow down to its tenets or else. So it's not rational based. It's not based on science. It's based on a belief system that's been completely made up. And I have been waiting and hoping to see a First Amendment lawsuit brought by an employee of the public schools against the state of Washington for passing this law, and against their local school district. I expect to see that soon, I hope.
Next question, perhaps a more interesting spending measure would be how much we're spending per student who passes minimum test requirements. What do you think? I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that, but
he's saying, he's just playing games with numbers. So if only 30% are passing, right, that means we're spending well over half that again, to educate just the 30% that are passing. So, we're spending $30,000 to educate 30% to passing the state test, whatever.
It is interesting.
In other words, we're wasting a lot of money. We're spending a lot of money. We're not educating a lot of kids. And that should be alarming everyone. The purpose of education is to educate the children, not to maintain a system, not to employ, endless non-teachers in the system like we do.
It's also interesting to me that, when people bring up funding, it's almost always if there's a school with major problems, the answer is almost always that it needs additional resources. That very, very rarely do people talk about systemic problems and changes of the way you're doing things in order to get a better result. Usually it's, well, this school needs more money clearly because of these various challenges. And yet, I remember looking at the per pupil spending at some of the worst schools in New Jersey. And I want to say it was, north of $45,000 per student, just insane levels of spending going on. And the schools had not moved one iota when it came to achievement. I mean, they were truly dysfunctional places. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. It's not just teachers or administrators. There's a lot of social dysfunction that the schools are dealing with. But, keeping the kids trapped in this area where there's all this dysfunction guarantees, more of the same. And yet, there's this kind of, well, we, got to have some more resources. Even the court of New Jersey, Supreme Court of New Jersey ended up forcing the government to spend more, in part because the legislature forgot their own role to tell the courts, no, we're the ones with the purse. But they were spending a bunch more money and not looking at changes of the system in order to achieve a better result. It's just an interesting blind spot, I think, that a lot of us have. and it's easy to, to fall into, I think, when you're seeing a problem, even if you see it multiple times.
Well, if you put yourself in the position of a judge or a legislator sitting there trying to improve the schools, and there aren't many methods they have to do so, and the only one they really have is a top-down, give them more money tool. And but what they're refusing to do is to do the more, deep analysis, which is we have a monopoly system. It is stuck in its ways. It teaches reading poorly. It teaches math poorly. It doesn't do tests. It doesn't use tests to measure student learning throughout the school year. There's all kinds of failures, and it refuses to change because it is a monopoly. The schools of education are part and parcel of this. They've been teaching the wrong method of teaching to read for decades now, for decades. Since my child was in elementary school, they've been teaching the whole language method of teaching reading, which has been proven to be wrong. Talk about the science. The science of reading teaches deep instruction in phonics is the way we should be teaching reading, but the school system can't accept that because it doesn't want to. So really to add more money to a system that is so really just dysfunctional is the best word, Dave. Very good word. Better to understand it's a monopoly system. The way you fix a monopoly is to give people options out of the monopoly. And look at Mobdell. We broke it up in the 70s. We can break up the public school monopoly in the 2020s with school choice.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that's what I was thinking of as well. I'm barely old enough to remember when there was the debate about breaking up the phone company, and I remember the news reports that big concern about whether we'll keep that quality up, because who knows what's going to happen there's going to be a bunch of people without service. It's going to be terrible. And, here we are, we've got cell services that are super cheap, super mobile. You've got the power of a computer, and of multiple computers back in those days. I mean, your phone has so many apps that do so many different things. You've got a radio, a computer,
Yes.
a scanner.
Yes.
You just got everything in the palm of your hand, a game console,
Yes.
a camera, all these things here. And yet, back in the day it was, well, if you get rid of this monopoly system, you're not going to have that fine rotary party line phone anymore.
Yes. And you could choose amongst the colors of that block phone. That's all you could choose amongst, white, black, or red, right? Now imagine, apply that to public education. I mean, here we're seeing options, developed by families, micro schools popping up to teach their kids their own way. There's so many wonderful ways. If we were to free parents, the Montessori method, there's all kinds of great ways to educate children that are more effective, more individualized, more customized than the current standardized one-size-fits-all model. And thousand flowers of blooming of creativity would just be unleashed if we just let parents control the money. They would get together, a group of parents would get together with their money. Imagine 10 of your friends with $10,000, you could go hire a teacher and have classrooms of 10 children in each classroom. You could hire a professor from UW who can teach physics, even though he's not allowed in the high school classroom because he doesn't have a teaching credential.
It might actually be that there would be this opportunity for people to, create a new school, much smaller, much, focused on something that, that inspires their particular student. It would be a very individualized approach.
I think for boys, imagine young boys who cannot sit still in seats. They could start out there. Look at Finland. They outside most of the time for the first early years because it's just inhumane to make little boys sit for too many hours of the day. So you could create so much better personalized schools that respond to the needs and strengths of the children. I mean, special ed kids, they really get to serve by our system. Low-income kids that come with more challenges than most could get much better training and teaching in the schools if we were to free up their parents. Anyway, it's possible. It can be done.
Yeah. The next question, I heard a 4th dose of mRNA vaccines is being promoted. What will the State Department of Health want? Elizabeth, any comment on that?
That was just approved by the FDA earlier today. And I think the State Department of Health will be all on board with authorizing that for age 50 plus. And, that's an individual choice if people want to get it. I did read that scant research was done into this fourth vaccination route. It was more of a stopgap between now and next fall, and growing numbers of elderly and wanting to continue to protect them. And I don't have enough of that information about that ruling today yet to talk too much about it, but I assume the Department of Health will be all on board.
Once again, when she does get that information, it will be at washingtonpolicy.org, probably on the blog. So keep checking, check the blog daily.
One of the things I just want to remind everyone is this is really about, at this point in the COVID game, figuring out if the cures are worse than the disease, and so we continue to evolve. None of us knew anything in March of 2020. We know a lot more now, and the mask mandate was undone in our state, which is sort of interesting to me that was undone before the vaccine mandate, because I kind of see it the other way. It should have gone, but we're analyzing, are the cures worse than the disease, and the service level drops to taxpayers because of the employee mandate for vaccines is unacceptable, and the discrimination involved in all of it, because both sides can contract and spread the virus, is just unacceptable.
I know that there was, Leave mentioned earlier, some of the kids that were protesting, wanting masks back. And, I've done enough grocery shopping around and gotten some looks from folks for not wearing anything. But I think part of that is, there was an international study done of media coverage of COVID, and in the United States, the coverage was overwhelmingly negative in every way, whereas in international markets, the coverage was much more balanced in terms of, this is a positive thing, the risk is low over here, and this is a negative thing. So people had a better sense of the reality of danger, whereas we had the if it bleeds, it leads kind of thing. And surveys of people based on their political persuasion show that people that are on the left side of the spectrum, so to speak, they tend to be much more frightened of the potential for COVID infection, because their perception of the death rates and hospitalization rates is wildly out of sync with what the reality is. And so, there's a part of me that kind of feels sad for people that are still, they're denying themselves the ability to visit family and friends, and they're angry with people about not wearing masks. And I think part of that is, there hasn't really been a responsible attempt at balancing out, the dangers and giving people a real perspective on risk there.
Yeah, this is all about risk benefit analysis, and the fact that we've not trusted people to do that risk benefit analysis for their situations is just horrible. Well,
tell you what I'm going to do. We have quite a few questions open. We'll have those listed for Center directors to respond to. We've got just a few minutes left, and I just want to encourage people again to share the blog. It's been numerous times today, where you've had the opportunity to remember, hey, go to our blog at washingtonpolicy.org on a daily basis. New information pops up there all the time from all of our researchers. And it's a great resource for Washington State local news on policy, on state policy that impacts you and your family. The way you can live your life, the way you can operate your business, raise your kids, and other information. So go to washingtonpolicy.org. And if you enjoy our work, please consider joining Washington Policy Center, support the work of Washington Policy Center, and encourage your friends and family and neighbors to do so as well. So we don't want to keep this information in isolation. We want you to be able to share it out there as well. Thank you, Elizabeth Hovde and Lee Finne, our center directors, respectively. Thank you for coming on today, and thank you for tuning in. We'll be back not next week, but the week after, every other week now, We'll be back with another episode of Washington Policy on the Go. Thank you for attending, and we'll see you soon.